In the summer of 1483, two boys walked into the Tower of London. Edward, aged 12. Richard, aged 9. The sons of a dead king. The rightful heirs to the English throne. They were never seen again. For over 500 years, we have been told the same story. Their uncle, Richard III, had them smothered in their beds so he could take the crown. It is the most famous murder in English history. It is the crime that defines the most famous villain in English literature. There is just one problem. The story might not be true. This is the follow-up to my Richard III video. If you haven't watched that one, the short version is this. Almost everything you think you know about Richard III comes from Shakespeare, who was writing Tudor propaganda 100 years after the fact. Modern historians have dismantled most of it. The hunchback was exaggerated from a minor scoliosis. The murders of his brother, of the king before him, of his own wife, all of them fall apart under examination. But there was one charge I couldn't clear him of in that video. The princes in the tower. Because the honest answer, for 5 centuries, has been that we simply don't know what happened to them. Until now. Because in 2023, the same researcher who led the project to find Richard III's skeleton under a parking lot published new evidence. Evidence that she believes solves the case. Evidence that suggests the two boys didn't just survive Richard's reign. They survived long enough to come back and fight for their throne. Today we're going to go through the whole mystery. The disappearance. The suspects. The theories. And the new evidence that is starting to rewrite history for the second time in a decade. This is the real story of the princes in the tower. To understand what happened, you have to understand where these boys stood in the summer of 1483. Their father, King Edward IV, had died suddenly in April of that year. He was 40. His eldest son, Edward, was 12 years old and the new king, Edward V. His younger son, Richard, Duke of York, was 9. Edward IV had, on his deathbed, named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector. Richard's job was to govern the country until young Edward was old enough to rule on his own. This was normal. This was how it was supposed to work. Then everything fell apart in about 6 weeks. First, a priest named Robert Stillington came forward with an explosive claim. He said that before King Edward IV had married the boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, he had already been secretly pre-contracted in marriage to another woman. Under canon law, that meant the marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid. And if the marriage was invalid, the two boys were illegitimate. And if they were illegitimate, they could not inherit the throne. Parliament accepted the claim. They passed an act called Titulus Regis formally declaring the boys illegitimate. And they offered the crown to the next legitimate adult male in the Yorkist line. Who was Richard, Duke of Gloucester? The boy's uncle. Richard accepted. He was crowned Richard III on July 6, 1483. The two boys were moved from the royal apartments in the Tower of London, which was not a prison at this point but a royal residence, to private rooms deeper inside the complex. They were seen by servants. They were seen playing in the gardens. And then, sometime in the late summer of 1483, they stopped appearing in public. They did not die publicly. No funeral was held. No bodies were shown. No announcement was made. They simply were not there anymore. And that is where the mystery begins. For 500 years, The traditional answer has been that Richard had them killed. But here is what almost nobody tells you. That answer rests on almost no contemporary evidence at all. The most famous account of the murder, the one that shaped everything afterward, was written by Sir Thomas More in the early 1500s. More was not an eyewitness. He was 5 years old in 1483. He was writing roughly 30 years later, under a Tudor king whose entire legitimacy depended on Richard III being a monster. And More's primary source was Cardinal John Morton, a man who had personally conspired against Richard and had every reason in the world to lie. More's account tells us that Richard ordered the boys killed, that two men named Miles Forrest and John Dighton smothered them with pillows, and that their bodies were buried somewhere in the tower. It is vivid. It is detailed. It is also, by More's own admission, based on hearsay. More never finished the book. He never published it. It circulated privately, and only became public after his death. Here is what we know did not happen. When Henry Tudor seized the English throne from Richard at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, he had every possible motive to produce the bodies of the princes and announce that Richard had killed them. It would have been the ultimate propaganda coup. The final nail in his predecessor's reputation. He did not do that. No bodies were produced. No formal murder charge was ever filed against Richard during Henry's reign. Henry repealed the Titulus Regis, the act that had declared the princes illegitimate, and he ordered every copy of it destroyed. Historians have always asked why. The standard answer is that Henry wanted to marry their sister Elizabeth of York and needed her to be legitimate. But repealing the act had a side effect. It made the princes legitimate again too. Which meant, if they were alive, they were the rightful kings. And Henry was the usurper. Why would Henry do that if he knew they were dead? Unless he wasn't sure they were dead. Before we get to the 2023 evidence, we have to look at the other suspects. Because even if you believe the boys were murdered, Richard is not the only person with a motive, and not even the most obvious one. Suspect number 1, beyond Richard himself, is Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham was one of Richard's closest allies in the spring of 1483. He helped Richard take the throne. And then, just a few months later, in the autumn of 1483, Buckingham launched a rebellion against him. Nobody has ever fully explained why. Some historians believe Buckingham had his own claim to the throne and was positioning himself. Some believe he flipped because he had ordered the murder of the princes himself, without Richard's knowledge, and was now trying to cover his tracks or capitalize on the chaos. He had the access. He was Constable of England. He had the keys to the Tower. Suspect number 2 is Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother. A fiercely intelligent, fiercely ambitious woman whose entire life was dedicated to putting her son on the English throne. For Henry to become king, the princes needed to be out of the way. Margaret was in London in the summer of 1483. She had resources, allies, and motive. Some modern historians have pointed out that she has almost never been seriously investigated, largely because Tudor historians would have had no interest in implicating the king's mother. Suspect number 3 is Henry Tudor himself. This one requires the boys to have survived Richard's reign, which for centuries was considered impossible. But if they did survive, and if they were still alive when Henry took the throne in 1485, then Henry had the strongest motive of anyone. He had just taken a crown that, under the newly restored law, did not belong to him. The boys were the biggest existential threat to his entire dynasty. He was ruthless. He executed every legitimate Yorkist claimant he could get his hands on over the next 20 years. If the princes died, and they may have, the person with the most to gain from their death was not their uncle. It was the man who replaced their uncle. Which brings us to the woman who may have cracked this case. Her name is Philippa Langley. She is the amateur historian who, against the scorn of the professional academic establishment, led the project that found Richard III's skeleton under a Leicester parking lot in 2012. DNA tested it. Reburied him with royal honors in Leicester Cathedral in 2015. After that reburial, she read a newspaper article calling Richard a child killer. The article cited no evidence. It simply repeated the traditional story. Langley decided to do the same thing she had done with the skeleton. Treat the accusation as an open case. Go back to the primary sources. Search the archives. Follow the evidence wherever it led. She called it the Missing Princes Project. It ran for 10 years. It involved more than 300 researchers across 7 countries. And in 2023, she published her findings in a book called The Princes in the Tower: Solving History's Greatest Cold Case. It became the subject of a Channel 4 documentary in the UK and aired on PBS in the United States as part of the Secrets of the Dead series. Her conclusion is extraordinary. Langley believes both princes survived. She believes they were smuggled out of England during Richard's reign, probably with his knowledge and possibly on his orders, to keep them safe from the chaos of the moment. She believes they were taken in by their Aunt Margaret, the Duchess of Burgundy, on the continent. And she believes they came back. Here is the evidence. Not all of it. The project produced a huge body of archival material. But here are the pieces that have most impressed the historians who have reviewed the work. First, an accounting receipt found in the archives at Lille, France, dated December 16, 1487. The receipt documents a purchase of 400 pikes by the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, on behalf of Margaret of Burgundy. The weapons were intended for the Yorkist invasion of England that year. And the receipt specifies that they were being purchased on behalf of a son of Edward IV. The traditional history has always said that the person leading the 1487 invasion was a 10-year-old boy named Lambert Simnel. A commoner. A fraud. The Tudor story is that Lambert Simnel was pretending to be someone else entirely, a Yorkist cousin named the Earl of Warwick, who was actually in the Tower at the time. The Lille receipt does not say Lambert Simnel. It does not say Earl of Warwick. It says son of Edward IV. Which, if true, would mean the boy being funded and armed by the royal houses of Europe in 1487 was Edward V, the elder of the 2 missing princes. Second, an even more significant find. A document in the account books of Henry VII himself. When the most famous pretender of the era, a man known to history as Perkin Warbeck, was captured and brought to London in 1497, Henry's own financial records list him with expenses. But the name Henry's own clerks used for him, privately, was not Perkin Warbeck. It was the Duke of York. Richard, Duke of York, was the name of the younger prince. And here is the behavior that goes with it. When Henry VII captured this man, he did not execute him. Henry VII, who had executed every Yorkist claimant he could find, hunted him to the ends of Europe, left this one alive for 2 full years. He housed him at court. He let him see his wife. He gave him a room in the king's own wardrobe, which sounds like a closet, but was actually a private chamber with access to the royal household. Henry treated him, several foreign ambassadors noted at the time, like a member of the family. That is not how kings treated commoners claiming to be princes. That is how kings treated princes they did not know what to do with. Langley's argument goes further. She believes the two boys the Tudors later dismissed as impostors, Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, were actually the two princes. She believes the Tudor government invented the humble origin stories for them, the boatman's son, the joiner's son, because it was the only way to deny their claims without having to prove them dead. She believes Edward V died at the Battle of Stoke Field in 1487, fighting to take back his throne. She believes Richard of York was eventually captured, forced to sign a confession declaring himself to be Perkin Warbeck, and executed at Tyburn in 1499. If she is right, both princes survived their uncle's reign. Both princes fought for their throne as young men. And both princes were killed, eventually, not by Richard III, but by the Tudor dynasty that had replaced him. Now I have to be honest with you about where this stands. Not every historian accepts Langley's conclusions. Professional academics have been divided. Some, including the barrister Rob Rinder who worked with her on the Channel 4 documentary, find the evidence persuasive. The Wall Street Journal called her work a gripping piece of historical detection. Other scholars have been more cautious, pointing out that a single line in an accounting receipt can be read in multiple ways, and that the documents do not constitute the kind of airtight proof you would get from a modern courtroom. The single piece of evidence that could settle this once and for all exists. In 1674, workmen renovating the White Tower found the bones of two children buried under a staircase. The bones were reinterred in Westminster Abbey as the princes. They have been examined only twice, in the 17th century and again in the 1930s, with the technology of the time. They have never been DNA tested. We have Richard III's DNA. We have a direct female line descendant of the prince's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, living today. A modern DNA test would resolve, within days, whether those bones belong to the princes or not. The Crown has refused permission for over 50 years. Nobody outside the royal household knows exactly why. The official explanation is respect for the dead. But for 540 years, the most famous missing persons case in English history has been one test away from an answer, and the test has never been allowed to happen. So where does that leave us? We know the princes went into the Tower in 1483. We know they stopped appearing in public that summer. We know the traditional story, that Richard III had them murdered, rests on hostile Tudor sources written decades later and has almost no contemporary evidence behind it. We know the behavior of Henry Tudor after he took the throne does not look like the behavior of a man who knew the princes were dead. He repealed the law that made him illegitimate. He never produced their bodies. He let Perkin Warbeck live for 2 years and treated him like family. We know the Lille receipt and the Henry VII account books both reference a son of Edward IV alive on the continent years after the boys supposedly died in the Tower. And we know the one test that would settle it, the bones at Westminster Abbey, remains off limits. The honest verdict is this. For 500 years, we believed Richard III killed his nephews because the people who replaced him told us so. The modern evidence, incomplete as it is, suggests the truth is stranger and probably uglier. The boys may have survived their uncle's reign. They may have come back as young men to fight for their throne. And they may have been killed, in the end, by the Tudor king we were told rescued England from their murderer. The greatest villain in English history may have been framed for a crime committed, eventually, by his successor. History is written by the winners. We've said that a lot on this channel. But occasionally, if you're patient enough to read the archives the winners didn't bother to destroy, a different story starts to take shape. A story where the monster under the bed was just a man, and the real villains were the ones who wrote the fairy tale. Richard III lay under a parking lot for 527 years before we dug him up. The princes in the tower have been lying somewhere, too, waiting for the same patience, the same refusal to take the traditional story at face value, the same willingness to open the old files. The case is not closed. But for the first time in 5 centuries, it is genuinely open. If this video made you rethink what you thought you knew, hit subscribe. I've got more coming. More people history got wrong. More villains who turned out to be victims. More cold cases that are starting to crack. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.